as I mentioned, I'm working in the executive director's office, so I cover all parks from Labrador down to Keji in Atlantic Canada. So that's pretty cool. But I'll be back working at Keji starting in March. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen and get into this, and hopefully you guys can see it okay. How's that look?
That looks good. That looks good now. Perfect.
Okay. So it's my title of my talk is Protecting Biodiversity in National Parks in a Time of Change. And it is a time of change, lots of happening. Soren updated us on the latest COVID results, and lots happening in the environment. And yeah, it seems like there is a lot of change happening right now. And certainly within national parks and protecting ecological integrity, which is our primary mandate, there's a lot of change and a lot of different thinking happening there. So I'll talk about that today. So first of all, I'll talk about our mandate, protecting ecological integrity, which is really about protecting biodiversity at our national parks. I'll be talking about the threats of invasive species and climate change, and also a case study. I'll be talking about hemlock and a species that's really on the edge here in Keji, and talk about how we're approaching that within Keji as a case study for protecting biodiversity in national parks. We'll start right at the beginning with the first national park. The mandate of ecological integrity was kind of wasn't really around at that point. Parks were created to start off with because of the beauty of the surrounding area, but was primarily for people to enjoy. And at the beginning, it was a lot about the railway and bringing people to very fancy hotels. And in fact, in a lot of the national parks at the beginning, there was a lot of resource extraction. Even mining for coal happened in Banff National Park at the beginning. So there wasn't a lot of thought to the wildlife, except we want to make sure people could see it. Really, it wasn't until 1918 that Point Pelee, when it was created, was primarily for bird watching, primarily for the point, which was a very small national park, but was already well known for being an amazing spot for bird watchers and birds coming through. But it also had its pressures, and in the 60s and 70s, lots of beachgoers, and the park at one point was even talked about shutting down because it was just so overrun with people. But that changed. They kept the national park and made some modifications. And Fundy National Park also was established during the time, very different. It was during more of a democratic time for park visitors, but still really modified the park a lot for people. In Fundy National Park, which I worked there for about 10 years, what you're looking down at here, this is just the opening of the national park. And in the bottom, there was a small pond, McLaren's Pond. That used to be a bog. And when they created the national park, they filled it in to make a nice pond and large lawn area, which they call the bowl. It's still there. And the golf course is still there, of course, too, from that time that they established the parks. By the time Keji was established in 1967, though, there was a shift towards more of a wilderness preserve, a place where nature would be observed, but also protected. And this is Jean Chrétien opening up the Keji at the parking lot back in 67. And Keji is an amazing park for its waterways, its forests, and its nature. It has been well preserved. There's certainly campgrounds and campsites, but people enjoy this area because it is been kept in a natural state. But we know there's been lots of changes that have happened in Keji over the years. There's been populations that have decreased. There used to be caribou, there used to be moose, of course. There still are moose, but at very small numbers in Keji. I have yet to see one. Coming from Cape Breton Highlands, where I was the park ecologist there, I'm still hoping I'll see a moose. But the pictures and the tails are etched on in the petroglyphs at Keji, and we know that there is a long history, human history of occupation in Keji by the Mi'kmaq. And at the Eowweir site, this is a park archaeologist finding some signs of that permanent or that continuous use of the Mi'kmaq of the Eowweir for 6,500 years in that area. So there's a long history, and that's why Keji National Park is a National Historic Site as well as a national park. So I mentioned ecological integrity, and I just want to define what that is. It's the components and processes which are typical of a healthy ecosystem that are intact and working, supporting the native species that live there. And this is to be the first priority of the National Parks Act. So this is a relatively new, within that history of national parks, it really came about in the 30s where they had a National Parks Act, but it wasn't until 2000 that this ecological integrity was enshrined within the National Parks Act. So how do we monitor, whoops, switching back and forth here. So how do we monitor ecological integrity? Well, we have a monitoring program which measures how things are doing in the ecosystem. We have 4 different ecosystems that we track very carefully. And we have a monitoring program which says how the status, how are they doing? So you can see in this example, we've got freshwater, wetlands, and forests are all in the green. This is our last State of the Parks report. And coastal marine was in the yellow, and that's mostly due to invasive green crab. If you want to drill into it in deeper way, you can see all the different monitoring measures that we have for the different ecosystems. And by tracking each of these, it lets us know how the ecosystem is doing. So for example, here is a water quality index is showing how our lakes are doing. And it's in the yellow, mostly because of low pH and higher mercury, but it's relatively constant. So over the years, we've collected this monitoring measure, well, since 2008 consistently. You can see that we're in the yellow, not a lot of trend there. If you look at other measures like this one here, which is water level monitoring, you can see that there's a lot of variation from year to year. But in general, we've been sticking to the green, which is good, with some variation. So the expectation is that if things are changing in the ecosystem and we suddenly start getting into the red, this is showing a problem that we should be addressing or trying to understand why that's happening. But we know there's big changes coming. Big changes have happened over time, and we're starting to see those happen in the ecosystem. So with climate change, we know we've seen a 1.6 increase in our mean temperature in Keji area over the last 100 years, which is pretty incredible. And actually, it's warmer 2-degree increase in our fall temperatures are even higher. So we have this change happening, and we know that the future, we're going to see more increases in temperature. And these 2 scenarios showing the highest scenario, the RCP 8.5, and the more moderate increase of RCP 2.6, but still looking at large increases in temperatures, which will have an impact on ecological integrity and on our ecosystems. In fact,
Matt, what's RCP? Sorry.
RCP, it's the modeling. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's always brought up as RCP, so I always forget what it is.
Okay.
But
okay.
Let's see if I can find it here for you. RCP. This is out of the Canadian climate change report that was put out last year. So it's a scenario. It's not related to. It's related to the amount of carbon that's put into the atmosphere. So in this case here, this is showing a displacement of tool, which is showing where Keji will be in a future climate of the high scenario, RCP 8.5. By 2080, our climate will be more like New Jersey. So it's showing the movement of Keji to New Jersey area. So that's pretty incredible in terms of change. Of course, this is the worst scenario. This is a scenario with no change in our current carbon emissions. We're seeing extreme weather in terms of hurricanes. This Hurricane Dorian, the damage that was done to Hemlocks and Hardwoods Trail, huge areas, large areas that were damaged by the high winds. And we're also seeing increase in invasive species, and this is connected to climate change because a lot of species that are further south are expanding, and especially with forest insects, you can have a lot of forest insects do better with warmer temperatures. So they're definitely interconnected. But invasive species is another major threat to Keji biodiversity and ecological integrity. You can see that it's not the first invasive species to arrive at Keji. We have a long list of species, but it does seem to be accelerating with very serious beach bark disease, which started in Point Pleasant Park, would have swept through Keji likely in the 30s, 40s. We had glossy buckthorn, European green crab in the 50s, and really has been causing a lot of changes along our seaside portion of the park. White nose syndrome decimating bats that was arrived in Keji in 2012. Hemlock woolly adelgid was found in 2018, and I'll be talking more about that. And then we also have chain pickerel impacting our aquatic ecosystems. On the doorstep or already in the park in terms of smallmouth bass and beach leaf mining weevil, but also soon to arrive at the park is emerald ash borer. So this calls into question a lot about what ecological integrity in the parks and how we maintain ecological integrity with all of these changes. So I'm going to talk a bit about this in relation to our hemlock forests and the threat of hemlock woolly adelgid. I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm sure you guys have talked about hemlock woolly adelgid, you know about it. But if you have any questions during the talk, please just jump in and ask more detail. So it was found in Keji in 2018, and really 2017 it was discovered in Nova Scotia, but it had spread since 1950s from Virginia and come north. And this is going to have a serious impact on, and is having a serious impact on the hemlock forest of Keji. We expect 80% hemlock mortality within 4 to 10 years. It's a little bit unsure of exactly how much mortality, but it will be high. I'd say 80%, likely higher than that after 15 or 20 years. It all varies in terms of how quickly the trees decline. So this will have a big impact on our old growth forests, cooling effects along streams, and biodiversity that depend on hemlock forests. This will also have an impact on our facilities and the visitor experience, the camping. People love Keji hemlocks. So why is it hemlock woolly adelgid such a problem? Well, it's an invasive species. It's non-native, but we have lots of non-natives which aren't a serious issue. But with an invasive species, there's really no control at this point. And the species they attack, hemlock, have very little resistance or no resistance at all to HWA. Hemlocks, HWA, hemlock woolly adelgid, is a small, tiny insect. It's aphid-like. It's a sucking insect, and this is blown up quite large. It's about the size of a poppy seed. It's tiny, but it can produce many individuals just from one. They're all female, all clones, and they have 2 generations a year, producing 7,500 individuals a year. So they can overwhelm a tree very quickly. You can see that there's this whip-like mouth part, and that is inserted into the tree, and they suck the nutrients out of the trees. And as there's no proven resistance to HWA in hemlocks in North America. So this is what it looks like. Very difficult to see on the left here side. You can see that it's just the nymph stage. They're really hard to find. Once they have more wool on them on the right, it's easier to see that, and it's on the underside. So most of the time they're stationary. They're at the base of the needles. They don't eat the needles, as I said. They're sucking the nutrients out of the tree at the base of the needle. This is a picture of a crawler. I'm just going to try to see if it actually works here. You can see in the center here, it's like an egg with legs. They're very tiny, and they hatch twice a year, and they go in search of another hemlock. They're not particularly mobile, but they do. If they do get on a bird or on a mammal and they're dropping out of trees, it's very easy, to sheer number of them, to be moved to another stand, and they can move approximately 15 miles per year. But within Nova Scotia, it seems that it's like a wildfire right now. They're jumping ahead in different places. You can see this is an up-to-date map of where HWA is now as of the fall of 2021. And you can see the 5 counties have been fully infested. There's certainly places within that don't have HWA, but if more often than not, if you go to a stand within the 5 southerly counties, you're going to find HWA there, and it's spreading into Lunenburg and into Kings. We know a lot about hemlock woolly adelgid because of the states, and it's spread up through the states, very quickly, moving from Virginia south into the Great Smokies and through the Shenandoah, and the incredible hemlock they had there. Yeah, it's just hard to believe the size of some of those trees. And unfortunately, a lot of those trees died, and they died very quickly. The HWA moved very fast in the south due to the temperatures, warmer temperatures, and the fact that trees were less able to survive infestation, and they often died within 1 or 2 years. And so this is the images you can see of some of the hemlocks from that area when the infestation had gone through very quickly. And so that's from the Great Smokies. So hemlock are a treasured tree within Keji, the Hemlocks and Hardwoods Trail. I know a lot of you, if you've gone on the Hemlocks and Hardwoods Trail, remember this tree that was there. A lot of people take their picture. It's a very beloved tree, of course, because that's how old it can get, but also for the biodiversity, unique biodiversity in the hemlock stands. So at Keji, we're faced with, well, what can we do? So there's management plan that had been written just prior to HWA arriving in Keji. It laid out some ways that you could help your hemlock trees, help reduce HWA impacts. And there was a guidance document that was also written for Parks Canada, really going into the literature, finding out, well, what are they doing in the U.S.? What can be done to help protect hemlock forests in Keji? So at this point, I was the project manager for the first couple of years of the project. and I help to advise the project now as a scientific support. Dave Ireland, who's actually on the call here as well, he's the project manager currently, and it's a difficult task right now to know how to what to do with hemlock woolly adelgid in the park. It's a very invasive species, and it can overwhelm hemlock trees very quickly. You can't get rid of it. Once it's in a stand, it's there. So we looked at different options on what we could do at Keji. And one thing that I think is very handy to think about in terms of ecosystem management, this is from a new paper from the US, which looks at resist, accept, direct, or RAD, it's called, framework for a natural resource manager. So what can you do in face of climate change? What can you do in the face of invasive species? And these are management options that are being used across Parks Canada sites to look at how we can protect ecological integrity in a time of change. Because resisting the change is in some cases impossible, or it require a huge amount of resources, or is not feasible. And accept may be the right situation in some cases, or you can also direct. So I'll talk a little bit about what each of those are. So resist, of course, would mean you try to maintain the current historical ecosystem structure and function. So I'll talk about what that means in terms of hemlock woolly adelgid in a second. Accept would be you accept that these transformations are going to happen and that a different type of ecosystem is going to emerge afterwards with different biodiversity. Direct is when you try to steer the ecosystem in a certain direction, trying to direct what kind of biodiversity, ecosystem structure, and functions there through different management actions. So I'll talk a little bit about hemlock woolly adelgid and resist. And this is the people who want to save hemlock. They want to resist the change and hold on to what we have. So there are different pesticides that can be used for hemlock trees to help them survive when they have HWA. And the only one that's approved currently in Canada right now is the Imajet system, which is an imidacloprid, is the name of the compound. It's a neonicotinoid, which is toxic to insects. It's a systemic pesticide, which is injected into the tree. And this is taken up by the tree. And then you have HWA, of course, because they're a sucking insect. They ingest it, and this causes them to die and reduces the number of HWA on the tree. The tree is able to survive. There's other products which are used in the US and other methods which are used in the US, but are currently not approved in Canada, and some of them may not be approved in Canada just because of the concern with neonics or neonicotinoids, which are used a lot in agriculture, but there are big concerns with its impacts on pollinators like bees and other insects, because of course it is toxic to insects. But it has a very low toxicity and no health concerns for mammals and vertebrates. So it's a very much targeted towards insects. And using this Imajet system, which is injecting the chemicals into the tree, it's kept from the environment and it's inside the tree. Triazine I won't talk too much about because I don't want to take up too much time, but that's another chemical which is currently being tested by CFS or Canadian Forest Service, which uses the neem nut. And neem, it's derived from neem, and it's injected in the tree. It's similar. It's really quite expensive, but it's also being tested. So these are the main product right now that can be used is an Imajet, or made by the Arborjet company. Another way to resist HWA is biocontrols. And I threw this one picture of a wasp up here, which is actually being released in Canada for emerald ash borer in the US, because this type of biocontrol um, it's a parasitoid, so it lays its eggs in its host, and that host then serves as a place for the eggs to hatch and food. And often most biocontrols are used within agriculture, um, and that's where a lot of biocontrols are developed is for the agro business, especially in greenhouses, and for really costly pests. A lot of them are parasitoids. Unfortunately, for HWA and for hemlock, I guess fortunately for hemlock, HWA, but there are no parasitoids for HWA in its native range. So by taking, you can only bring over predators, and they're less effective in terms of reducing numbers than parasitoids. But a lot of biocontrols have been released in the States. It's not approved in Canada yet, and it's going to take time to do a lot of testing to make sure to see if these predators will have an impact, can be released in Canada. And Canadian Forest Service is doing that work right now, and it will probably take 5 to 10 years before that work is complete and the biocontrols are approved. But the two biocontrols which are looked at right now is Laricobius nigrinus, which is a beetle which feeds on HWA, and a silverfly, which is Leucopus, is the genus of that fly. So both of those will eat HWA, but looking at the numbers from the U.S., there's certainly not enough that you see enough predation that you see numbers dropping quickly after these biocontrols are released. But this would be another way that hemlock woolly adelgid could be lowered in numbers, and certainly one that's more sustainable over time, because these biocontrols would grow and become part of the natural control for HWA. So the long-term plan in terms of what to do about HWA, we know we had a serious issue in Keji with decline of the trees, and it was happening very quickly. We could see that the HWA was spreading through the park, and it was having an impact on some of our old growth stands in terms of high infestation levels. So a detailed impact assessment was written by the HWA team with a lot of support from national office, a public document that was released, and this described how we're going to work on reducing, or probably on helping, the HWA problem in Keji and keeping HWA. Sorry, my phone keeps going off here. I'll turn it off. So this document first started right away with determining, well, which stands would we protect? So there's a hemlock stand prioritization framework was done, and this was to isolate stands within Keji that were those that would be the highest priority to protect. There's so much hemlock within the park, certainly only those stands which are the highest priority could be treated with this systemic pesticide. So these are some screen captures from the prioritization story map. And you can see Big Dam Lake and Dennis Boot Lake were two areas which were seen to be very important for protecting hemlock, and that was due to their old growth condition, the amount of hemlock there, the size, the proximity to water, if it was in an area that was drought resistant. All these factors, including being a place where people could visit, is another factor. So all those factors went into prioritizing stands within Keji for pesticide treatment. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that's happened at Big Dam Lake in terms of protecting the trees there. So all this work happened this fall. This is the Imajet system. So it involves injecting the trees with imidacloprid. A plug is put into the tree. First you drill a hole, then you put the plug in, and then you inject the system. It's a pressurized system and injects the imidacloprid into the tree. There's many injection sites that have to happen. Here's a small, you can see here, a small injection site there. And one of our technicians putting the pesticide into the tree. And we targeted the largest trees within the stand. You can see here some pictures of this work happening right along the hemlocks and hardwoods trails. So there were people that were visitors that came by that saw this work, as well as we had a lot of our partners that came to observe. And you can see that the injection sites are being put in there. So MTRI was there. Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq has been a partner throughout this exercise, and really interested to see how the work happened. KMKNO, Mi'kmaq Rights Organization of Nova Scotia, was very interested in the work and was part of our consultation process throughout the development of the plan and detailed environmental assessment. So this is the one method, is the stem injection. As part of an experiment outside of the park, we've also looked at other options for treating trees. Doing the stem injections, it's very labor intensive. There's a lot of injection points. So for a large tree, there may be 10, 15 different injection sites that have to happen. And the Imajet chemical is quite expensive. In the US, there's a lot of other methods that are used, and they often don't only use the injected type Imajet method when they're very close to water. A lot of cases they're using soil drenching. Basil bark spray is also another method. So we worked with Canadian Forest Service, the province, to investigate how the basil bark treatment would work. And this is with Zytec 2F. It's also an imidacloprid product, and it's sprayed on the base of the tree and is drawn up into the tree, and it has a similar impact as Imajet, in that it kills the HWA and protects it for 5 to 7 years. So important part of this was to look at the non-targeted impacts, because if you're spraying the insecticide on the outside of the tree, this has an impact likely around the base of the tree if there's any spray. So we wanted to make sure that we recorded any of those non-target impacts. So we partnered with Acadia University. There's a picture of Cody Chapman, who's doing his master's, looking at arthropods in the canopy and subcanopy to see what the impacts are of non-target impacts or of imidacloprid on those insects. So he did pre-data in this area, and this was near Sisebou and also down at McKay Lakes in Shelburne County, looking at before and after. And we're also looking at the impacts of using Zytec 2F and imidacloprid on pollinators. So this is another really interesting study that's happening with Luca Voscourt. He's at Acadia University, and he collected some pre-data on pollinators in hemlocks and hardwoods, and also outside of the park, in some of the same spots that Cody's working in, looking at what bees are using and other pollinators are using hemlock forests. Because unlike agriculture areas where imidacloprid is used, there's a lot less flowering plants, but there are some. And it was really interesting going out with Luca to look at what flowering plants were in the hemlock forest, what bees were using them. So he's collecting this data and then we're going to use some chemicals to treat those areas, the Zytec, possibly in the spring, to look at how it would impact pollinators. The plan is to do it outside of the park for sure. Inside the park, we're still working with our Mi'kmaq partners to see if this will happen, to see how to do some work on this area of research using Zytec because of its advantage of being cheaper and easier to apply it in larger areas. So here's a map showing some of the trees that were treated in hemlocks and hardwoods. You can see there's a large number of trees that were done. They had, and the dots represent the size of the tree. So these trees were very large, and so we had over 500 trees treated. The average DBH was 70, around 70 centimeters DBH. And you see the clusters of darker spots. Those are the pollinator plots where we're going to look at the impacts of imidacloprid on pollinators. So the plots that Luca was working on are located in those spots. Trees were also treated in Jeremy's Bay campground. Those trees were a bit smaller. So this is all related to treating the trees resisting HWA. So a different method would be to accept. So I'll talk a little outside of the areas that would be treated. You've got a lot of hemlock mortality that's going to happen over the next few years. And this is what it looks like. This is down around Sisebou. You can see there's a lot a lot more light coming through the canopy. You have trees that are dead or very close to being dead in this area. And from some tree ring analysis that we did, these trees likely were infested or started to decline, I should say, around 2014, 2013. This has happened before, and not from HWA, but from pale wing gray. You might have heard before in Keji there was a hemlock. It was an insect or moth, I should say, that impacted hemlock trees, and we had a lot of mortality, especially around Merrimack-Edge and Canning Field area. And so this offers some clues to see what will happen after you have hemlock decline in these areas. So that pale wing gray was very quick. It's a native moth, but it killed a lot of trees around the mid 2000s. And now you can see some of them are still standing. You can see some regeneration coming up. In some cases, the regeneration is quite good. In other places, we're having some issues with high amounts of deer browse, so there's less regeneration coming back. So the question is really looking at these hemlock forests, especially they're so shady, lots of moss. What are these stands going to be like after HWA goes through? So we've been partnering with people like Dr. Keith Egger here, who's a retired mycologist, but he's been spending his volunteer time up in hemlocks and hardwoods doing surveys for mushrooms and fungi. So he's been collecting some really interesting new finds a new one many new ones for Nova Scotia, and a new Plotus, I believe, is the genus name of a mushroom that he found, which was only the second find in Canada. And just in my time walking around through hemlocks and hardwoods, you can see the incredible diversity of mushrooms. And this was an amazing year that Keith had. So be interesting to see his reports for this year. But hen of the woods here, and red tooth fungi is one of the weirdest mushrooms I've ever found. I found that one up around a hemlocks and hardwoods trail. And I'd only seen pictures of that one before. So amazing biodiversity there. The question is, how will this change over time? And how this will affect other biodiversity. So part of the work that we're doing is really looking to capture that information, what's there. So coral lichen is a rare lichen, which is found in old growth hemlock forest. It's just been recently found by Delbert, one of our master students working in the park on fish, found it in an old growth stand in the park. The one on the right is a rare lichen, stubble lichen, that was found by Troy McMullen from the Museum of Nature. That was found on hemlock resin. So it's, there's a lots to learn in these hemlock stands. So it is the do nothing, I would say, or the accept, I guess, is a difficult part, because everyone, a lot of people really love hemlock trees, and particularly the biodiversity that's there. But because of this invasive species and the challenge that presents, there are a lot of hemlock stands which are going to decline. I visited a place in Massachusetts, the Harvard Forest, where they actually had a hospice set up with art installation, which helped people say goodbye to hemlock stands, which is a really hard thing to do, but it's something that in this time of change, we also have to realize that we cannot keep things the same. Things will change. So that's something that I think national parks, because we have visitors or high profile place, we also have to help people come to terms with the loss of hemlock and help understand what's to come next, how this will change biodiversity. So last thing I'll talk about is direct. And this is where we get involved in trying to modify the trajectory in terms of how things change. So if you've been to if you've been to the stand at Jeremy's Bay, you realize there's a lot of hemlock trees in our campground. And so we knew that this was going to be an area where hemlock decline would be an issue. You'd have a lot of hemlock trees dying. And with visitors, that's a public safety issue. It also affects the visitor experience. So we started to do some silviculture in this area. 25 to 30% of the basal area was removed from Meadow Loop in Keji as part of a project, which is a pilot project, to see how it would work, how we operationalize this. And really the purpose of this was to get more light in the canopy and allow next generation of trees to grow up. Part of the problem with this is that there's a lot of deer in the campground. So we know that hardwoods in particular are an issue in terms of growing. So there's some fencing that was made using the hemlock from the campground to protect regeneration. And 2,000 trees were planted inside these exclosures, as well as some outside that were less palatable to deer, like red spruce. Here's some pictures of the planting by park staff and also by visitors. This was one very large family that was involved with planting one of these exclosures. So it involves the people getting in people that use the campground being part of helping the campground and really helping things move along in terms of the forest succession and realizing and being part of that change. So I'm almost at the end of the talk, but it's certainly been an experience being working at Keji with lots of different partners, all coming to terms with change and how to protect biodiversity. This is a Gantt chart showing the next stage, what's to happen down the road. So there will be more silviculture happening in the campground this winter. Another portion of the campground trees, 30%, 25 to 30% of the trees will be removed. Still lots of engagement with the Mi'kmaq as part of this project. And we'll be talking about other priority areas to do insecticides. There'll also be lots of monitoring of the trees within the campground, and also looking at how the trees are responding to the insecticide that was those 500 plus trees at hemlocks and hardwoods. So what can you do? Well, I would say I'm sure a lot of you have heard about HWA and really do appreciate our hemlock forests. Get involved, learn about HWA. If you are in hemlock stands, look to see if you can see it. There are different initiatives now that are happening involving volunteers to go out and help protect hemlock trees. That happened out at Sporting Lake, which is really incredible to see all the people getting involved in helping those trees. But yeah, try to understand, I guess, the complexity of the issue too. Also understand that we have to do research, understand the impacts of using the pesticides, as well as look at what biodiversity will be lost, because it is a very devastating insect that's going to have an impact on our forests. I just like to thank all the Keji staff that have been involved with the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid project. Project manager Dave Ireland's done an amazing job at getting all of those trees treated, trees planted, and a lot of the active management that I talked about today. And also the rest of the team there that's been involved since the beginning. We also have a Hemlock Woolly Adelgid working group in the Maritimes, which have done a great job working together to look at options for protecting our hemlock forests and really working together as a group. And there's a lot of icons there showing who's involved. So that's the end of my talk. I'm able to answer some questions. I can stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, and thanks for shutting your screen down, maybe so that we can, I'm going to get the gallery view, I think. So, yeah, thanks, Matthew. That was a nice overview of what you're doing. And I really enjoyed the resist, accept, and redirect approach. And I think, you know, it looks like you're doing a combination of that, which is probably good. And you're studying the effects, which is perfect. Now, if anybody if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat box at the bottom, or just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question if you have. So go ahead.
I see some in the chat here, Soren. Should you want me to answer some of those?
Yeah, let's do. I think some of those ones in the chats have been answered, but
yes, it looks like they have. Okay.
Yeah, I think they have been answered actually, as the talk went on. Does anybody have a question?
Well, I don't have a question, but I have a comment of appreciation. So I also really appreciated the framework that you presented, specifically the idea of the hemlock hospice. I think that resonated with me, and I appreciate you bringing up that concept, because I think a lot of the times in these times of change, like we don't want to lose anything, and it's really hard to grapple with that. And I was walking through the hemlock forest along the Gaspereau River here the other day, you know, and it's like there's a light snow and the light is shining through, and it's just so magical. But I stopped and I was like, I know that a lot of this is at threat, and we've been talking about Woolly Adelgid with the BNS for a while. So I think like reckoning with that loss and that grief is like really not something that we want to accept sometimes. So I'm really grateful that you kind of mentioned that as one of your like triad of approaches, because even if it's the most uncomfortable, like it is a reality. So so yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciated that, because I've been feeling really sad every time I walk through hemlocks recently.
Thanks.
No, that's
Go ahead,
yeah.
Matt.
I was really lucky that, and it had a big impact on me. I just happened to go by the Harvard Forest and to meet a guy there who wrote one of the books there on hemlock. Aaron, trying to forget his last name. Aaron Ellison. He's a bee. He's actually an ant expert. Loves ants, and he studied hemlocks in the Harvard Forest. And he was quite yeah, he was a really neat guy. He partnered with this artist, and you could walk through this hemlock hospice. At one point, there was a tree, and you could write in flagging tape a message to the hemlock, sort of saying goodbye, as like sort of like a funeral. Very very sad, but I agree. We have to come to terms with that, because a lot of it's very upsetting. Um, and it certainly has a big impact on the staff at Keji and the visitors. But I think that's part of our role, is to talk about that loss as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Matthew.
Larry?
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah, surely they've studied the changes that take place. I was just wondering if you could have some sort of projection as to what species will fill in when the hemlocks die, and how long it might take to get the equivalent forest.
Yeah, that's a good. I agree. There's been lots of study done, but I think there's still room for more particular studies to Nova Scotia, because if you think about it, hemlock forest, especially the type which is sort of like the pure hemlock, very little sunlight coming through, it's unusual for that all to die very quickly and then have a lot of light go through. Like you'd have more of the patch gap dynamics. And I think when we look at pale wing gray damage that happened in Keji, you see a lot of pine, you see a lot of fir, not a whole lot of hardwoods, unfortunately, because of the deer that we have. So that forest will grow back really quickly. But we're seeing some other areas in the park where you have a lot of ferns, really a lot of ferns growing up, because I think maybe some of those spots were a bit more moist and had already maybe a bit more fern cover to start with. If you have a lot of the forest dying very quickly, there may be some pathways that we don't know about that will happen within, because this is all new, right? It's very quick. Hemlocks dying. What will happen next? We don't know necessarily. So I think it's important that we track that and watch it very carefully. If the forest grows back in some cases where you have a lot of red spruce already in the understory, then you could have a very nice red spruce forest coming back in that area. We also have at the same time climate changes, right? So some species are going to be less able to regenerate or compete well after hemlock leaves. So in the States, they have black birch is actually the species that comes back the most after hemlock declines. We don't have that. I think yellow birch would actually be a good species to come back after hemlock declines, but in a lot of cases, we don't have a lot of yellow birch in these spots.
Thanks.
Matthew, has there been any sign of this in the Kentville Ravine, in the hemlocks there?
No, I haven't heard there's any, and I wouldn't be surprised if it shows up soon, because it seems to be moving quite quickly through the valley area. Um, so I would expect probably in the next year it will probably be detected. You can see how small it is. It's often in a spot for a while before it's detected too, because it's just very hard to check every little branch and look at it. They're using some new techniques like using eDNA um, to try to pick it up in the understory, which is kind of neat. But it's hard to find at low levels. But eventually, that one tree will spread a little bit more.
Yeah, I could maybe answer that question because I'm on the working group looking at the Kentville Ravine together with the town of Kentville and a number of other people. It hasn't been detected yet, but I believe it's already there because of the difficulty in actually locating it. And it's a little bit like if you think of the latest COVID variant Omicron, it showed up in South Africa, and once we knew it was there, we suddenly found it in Alberta and Ontario and Quebec, so it was already here. And I think with many of these invasive species, once we detect them, they are quite prevalent because of the difficulty. And there's talk. The discussion in the Kentville Ravine is whether we take the approach that they've done in catching places by injecting this imidac, whatever the name is for that pesticide. So there's talk right now, and in fact on Wednesday we're going to have another meeting to look into what to do in the Kentville Ravine, because the Kentville Ravine, of course, is a site where a lot of people go, and if the hemlocks die there, it's going to have a huge emotional impact, but it'll also have an ecological impact in that potential erosion of the ravine and all kinds of issues arising. Ken, if you are there, you might also talk about that, but I can't see you because I think you're called Caroline right now.
No, I'm not. I've changed my name.
You did change it. Good.
Yeah.
Good. I just can't see it right now, but that's okay.
Anyway, no, the Kentville Ravine, as far as we know, it's not there yet, but you will very well be correct that it is already there. There's always a threshold of detection that comes in with any invasive pest. It can be present for quite a while until finally someone stumbles on it. And this can be a fairly long term with some of the very subtle pests, or it can be fairly short if it's dramatic, like Dutch elm disease in the 1970s. If the tree is dying, okay, we know we have a problem, and it's big. And of course, we've had a number of these extinction events. And I wouldn't put too much hope on yellow birch coming in as the great savior after hemlock, simply because in the late 1940s, there was a birch dieback phenomenon that no one has really been successful in explaining it properly, but it caused widespread yellow birch dieback throughout basically throughout the range of yellow birch in Atlantic Canada. So there's been a number of these things. They're going to be a continuing challenge, and Keji I can remember Keji before it was a park, so that tells you how old I am. So anyway, that's basically my input.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Any other questions that people have? I might just go back to the.
Soren,
sorry, go ahead.
Soren,
Yes.
we have a stand of old growth hemlock at a place out near Butler Lake. I'm quite concerned now. I didn't realize how pervasive this is. If we see anything or we are concerned about it, where do we go to get someone to help us determine whether or not if it's present in our trees?
Well, it's the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that really are looking after that. And
Okay.
and last spring, I did give a field trip where we went out to look at how to survey for hemlock woolly adelgid, and I can certainly
Okay.
send you some information on how to look for it and what to look for and who to report to. So I could send this out to the, yeah, so if you email me, I will send that to you. And if anybody listening right now are interested, send me an email and I will send the information to you. But it is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that are kind of heading this up and yes.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And you can also watch, I did 3 years ago, I did made a documentary on the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is available through our website. And in fact, that little documentary on the hemlock woolly adelgid has now been watched, I think, over 2,000 times. So I guess it did something right, maybe. Anyway, any other questions?
Anyway, to follow up, that
Yes.
little thing is available on YouTube, and you can
Yes.
get it that way very easily.
Yes, it is, and I can send the link out. I believe the link is on our website as well. Any other questions? If not, I'd like to return to the real Caroline Bedaux's comment, because I really feel that, and this is talking from an emotional perspective, to be in a hemlock forest really is a spiritual experience. At least it is to me, and I think to a lot of people. And you probably heard me say this a number of times, but I have the slab of a hemlock tree that I got down from the Tobiatic, and that hemlock started its life in 1650, and it was cut down in 1992. So that tree was over 350 years old. And when you go through a hemlock stand and you begin to realize that these trees are that old, if you think of all the history that has passed and that they have experienced, it really is a travesty that they're being lost. But I think what we forget is that it is our action in terms of causing climate change that's really responsible for this. And right now, what we can do, we're trying to look or to do something about the symptoms, but the actual cause is something that we seem at the federal level not to be willing to really do, because our climate action is really not all that bold, and I'm not sure it's bold anywhere in the world. So I think we really need to begin to seriously think about the impact that we humans are having, because it really is a result of something that we have set in motion. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of species change distributions over time, and that's a natural process. The cattle egret, for example, that now is, it arrived from Africa, but it arrived on its own. A flock of them got blown across the Atlantic Ocean and arrived here. So species do show up and become native in a sense. And I guess, Matt, that's a long preamble into my question. But when you talked about the ecological integrity, you talked about protecting native species. But when does an introduced species become native? And I'm thinking of, say, for example, white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are not native to Nova Scotia, though I think many people would say, "What? Sure they are," but they're not. And we seem to we do classify the invasive ones as the ones that we really don't like. If we don't mind them, then we don't call them invasive species. Earthworms are an invasive species. They're not native to North America. we cherish having earthworms in the soil because of when the work they do. So, so so from a park's perspective, when does a native species, or when does an invasive species or a non-native become a native?
No, those are really good questions, Soren. And in terms of Parks Canada and our ecological integrity, it's pretty clear that it's about native species, right?
Right.
But we of course, can't ignore the fact that there's a lot of non-native species which are part of the ecosystem, and there's certainly some.
Oh, you disappeared, I think. Matt, I think you froze up.
Soren, if I may,
Yes,
it's Paul here.
yes.
The thought of native species and non-native species, I can understand introduced species, but when we look back millennia, right?
Yes.
There was nothing, or all the species that were here are mostly gone.
Yes.
And so there are migrations of species that have come and gone even.
Absolutely.
And so I'm interested in his response from the term of, or from the point of view of, as you mentioned, white-tailed deer or even wild turkeys.
Yeah.
You know, caribou are native here, but they're here no more, and that's probably more due to temperature and environment. How far back do we go to determine what was native?
Exactly. No, that's the the $1 million question, I think, because if we go back like to 12, 15,000 years ago, like there were no species here, or very, very few during the Ice Age, and all the species here kind of wandered back up here over time. So, and I think if you look at like mallard ducks were not native to Nova Scotia. They spread eastward as we cleared land. Many of the grassland birds were not here before Europeans arrived. So I think like we have to accept that ecosystems change. I love the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. He said, panta rei, everything flows, nothing stands still. And indeed, I think what we need to begin to think about is like, why is it that we humans want things to stay the same as opposed to just accept change? And I think it's really it's a philosophical thing. In industrialized societies, we've gotten to the stage where like we try as hard as we can not to get old, but of course that's a lost battle. Oh, I see Matthew is trying to come back in again, so yeah. I'll invite him back in. He probably didn't hear your question, but this is a huge discussion, and I think when change occurs very rapidly, then other species in ecosystems have no time to adapt to the change. When change occurs relatively slow, and fast and slow, of course, are relative terms depending on the species, then the other organisms organisms can adapt to the change. So rapid change has huge impacts. And the hemlock woolly adelgid, just as the longhorn borer, the Japanese, the elm borer, like they are spreading at an enormous rate, and there's no time for other organisms to adapt to that. And that's where we see impacts on ecological systems. Slower change, the systems can respond to it. Matt, I don't know if you heard the question. You froze up, and I see you're back. Thanks. And
Yeah, I did hear it.
okay, so maybe, so what are your thoughts on Paul's question
I'll
there?
just talk about it really quickly. That yeah, within Parks Canada, I think we're shifting our thoughts in terms of what that baseline is, in terms of having, maintaining everything to be the same. We have to think about the functioning ecosystems. How are they functioning as a whole, rather than looking at keeping all the pieces with all the parts and keeping it the same? Because we realize that there will be shifts. There have been changes, and perfect examples with white-tailed deer and then coyote coming later, which was a good thing. It was like, and there is, when there is these new assemblages of species, nature will find a way to reassemble and function. I'm not saying that with the loss of hemlock, there will be something else. We hopefully there won't be areas that are denuded of trees. So we're still gonna have trees growing, but we have to look and watch very carefully. I worked up in Cape Breton Highlands. In the case of the hyperabundant moose, we have large areas of grasslands now, no forest, and that's because you have hyperabundant population of moose there with no wolves. So in that case, there's a part of the ecosystem, a very critical part, which is a predator, which is missing. In the case of invasive species like hemlock woolly adelgid, you've got the case of no predator for that adelgid, and plus you have a situation where the species hemlock is very susceptible. So they would have evolved close enough that they know each other. They can eat, one can eat the other, but hemlock doesn't have the resistance because it had been so isolated. So now humans are moving things around and causing a lot of issues. And with hemlock, there's going to be rapid change, rapid decline, but there will also be rapid evolution happening as well. There's going to be, as the hemlocks decline in numbers, there are going to be some trees which are resistant. They found that in the States. There's some bulletproof trees that are there. They don't quite understand it, and it's also related to adelgid numbers are going to change, and they're going to be readapt to this new ecosystem. But all intents and purposes, we're going to have a collapse of hemlock, which is very sad, but that seems to be what's going to happen unless we do protect parts of the hemlock using the chemicals. But like I said, the problem is that we have a situation where the chemicals are very expensive, and it's not something, it's systematic. It's really has to be tree to tree. So there's really nothing that can be done on terms of a wide landscape scale. So what we're really looking at is protecting some of our key old growth stands so that people can see what these hemlock stands are like in the future, that are really incredible stand, very spiritual places, beautiful places that is very sad to see them being impacted by HWA in such a way.
Thanks, Matt. Does anybody have a last question before we finish? If not, then I would like to thank you, Matt, for giving a wonderful talk on the park and really focusing on this hemlock woolly adelgid little beast. And it certainly is the one that's on the top of people's minds who think about hemlocks right now, because it is going to ravage hemlock stands in Nova Scotia. There's no doubt about that, unfortunately, and it will change the landscape. So thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining us. And I would like to wish everybody a happy holiday, happy Christmas, happy solstice, whatever you prefer. And I might mention that the talk in January is going to be by James Churchill, and he's going to take a close look at the diversity of organisms in Miners Marsh. So that'll bring the talk right local, and I know many of you probably enjoy that marsh and walk there, and you may learn about all the various species that you maybe didn't know were there. So thanks very much, and Happy New Year to everybody, in case we don't talk again until then. Thank you. Good. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.